is the ship that goes sailing somewhere beyond the sea. She's there watching for me. If I could fly like birds on high, then straight to her arms I'd go sailing. It's far beyond the star, it's near beyond the moon. I know beyond a doubt my heart will lead me there soon. Beyond the shore, we'll kiss just as before. Happy we'll be beyond the sea, and never again I'll go sailing. I know beyond a doubt my heart will lead me there soon. We'll meet, I know we'll meet beyond the shore. We'll kiss just as before. Happy we'll be beyond the sea, and never again I'll go sailing.
This is for class for the week of March 30th. Let's turn to the extraordinary presidency of Harry Truman, the end of World War II, the dawn of the Cold War, and, above all, the extraordinary challenge of trying to live up to the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. So let's turn to Harry Truman. What did scholars have to say about this time period, the departure of Franklin Roosevelt, and the framing of the modern president as it would exist for years and years to come? Richard Neustadt, a longtime advisor to many presidents in the later 20th century, wrote this very famous book, Presidential Power. Came out in several editions. And he assessed the legacy of Roosevelt this way: weakness. Weakness is still what I see. Not that Roosevelt was weak, no. It's that Roosevelt was too strong. So strong that no other president could quite do what he did. Weakness is what I see, said Neustadt. Weakness in the sense of a great gap between what is expected of a man, or someday a woman, and assuredly an assured capacity to carry it through. Expectations arise as clerically tasks increase, while prospects for sustained support from any quarter worsen, as foreign alliances loosen and political parties wane. Who is going to be Roosevelt, except for Roosevelt himself? Other presidents, though, have always seen Roosevelt as setting the bar that they are meant to achieve. It's not that you're supposed to go against the Roosevelt vision or try to revise what the presidency should be. You're supposed to be the next Roosevelt. You're supposed to carry the torch. So it was with Barack Obama. As we'll see, several Democrats before him and since Roosevelt. What did Obama say, though? In Audacity of Hope, his campaign book from 2007, 2008, freedom is not an abstract idea. No, freedom is the very thing that makes human progress possible. It's a pragmatic thing. It's not just the ballot box, it's in our daily lives. And so one of our greatest presidents of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, understood this truth. He defined America's cause as more than the right to cast a ballot. He understood democracy was not just voting. He called upon the world to embrace the 4 fundamental freedoms. You remember that he announced in that fireside chat early in World War II. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, those are given, but also freedom from want, freedom from fear. They're not just freedom from kinds of oppression of speech and religion. That's old hat. It's also freedom from the human condition and the troubles that we face as a society. Government is there to alleviate them. These 4 freedoms, Obama said, reinforce one another, and you cannot fully realize one without realizing them all. The purpose of government, then, is not in any way opposed to freedom, as a lot of Roosevelt's critics said and a lot of conservative critics have said through the years. No, freedom is made possible by government. Government is there to actively ensure that everyone is able to pursue their freedom. And so the Roosevelt vision, that progressive vision that has stuck with us for years and years to come, as we'll see, is the major challenge to many future presidents. Some find themselves too weak for the task, some, as we'll see, are opposed to it, but those who try to achieve it place before themselves an extraordinary challenge. Certainly Obama did, so did Lyndon Johnson, so did Harry Truman. So who was Harry Truman? Born and raised in rural Missouri on a farm. His dad was a rough and tumble guy who was short and stocky, and yet had this real dynamic kind of personality. He'd pick fights with people. He had what many people call the Napoleon complex. Little Harry, though, was nothing like that, at least not in his youth. He read books all the time. He played the piano. He actually got quite good over the years. But despite his sort of quiet demeanor, little Harry did have a certain confidence about him that really lasted all throughout his life. Short, glasses, kind of nerdy kid, and yet he always knew who he was and where he was going. Grew up and enlisted in the army as World War I broke out and went over and served in the trenches in Germany. Saw some major combat, some of the worst combat that American troops saw over there, but really walked away with it with a sense of camaraderie, of drive, of what it means to reach deep down inside yourself to find courage and pull it out and make yourself go. Extraordinary experience for Truman. He never forgot his time in the trenches. It was very formative of his adult life. Came back home and married his junior high sweetheart, Bess Truman. And they had an extraordinary marriage. Unlike other presidents who just couldn't quite control themselves around other women, Harry Truman was absolutely faithful his entire life to Bess. They had one daughter, Rachel Truman, and she became quite an accomplished musician. Remember, Harry played piano as well, and so did his daughter. It so happened, an incident that really reveals Truman's personality, when a music reviewer, Paul Hume, wrote a pretty scathing review of one of Rachel Truman's performances. And Truman, as president in 1950, took the time to write this letter to Paul Hume. It seems to me that you are a frustrated old man who wishes he could have been successful. So you pick on other musicians, I guess. When you write such poppycock, as was the back section of the paper you work for, it is shown conclusively that you're off the beam and at least 4 of your ulcers are at work. Someday I hope to meet you, said President Truman. And when that happens, you'll need a new nose, a lot of beef for your black eyes, and perhaps a supporter below. Paul Hume was shocked. And in fact, he took this letter from the President of the United States and submitted it to newspapers all over the country. People couldn't believe that Harry Truman said this. Truman never said he was sorry. He stood by his daughter, and he stood by his words to Paul Hume. Well, a few years later, he actually invited Paul Hume to the White House, gave him a tour, kind of chit-chatted, kind of patched things up, and he said to the media, oh, it was a lovely conversation. But still, the fact that a sitting president would threaten with physical violence someone like this for a purely personal reason was quite a shock. But that was Truman's style. His closest advisor and personal advisor, more than his wife Bess, who he loved dearly, there was one person who really gave him his closest and most cherished advice, and that was his mother, Martha Truman. She was with him all the time in the White House. She traveled with him. She understood the ins and outs of American politics. She always pushed Harry, as she had throughout her life, to overcome, to outsmart his opponents, to rise above. Much more than his dad did. Indeed, Martha Truman was his greatest advisor. You could almost call her the First Lady, not as the president's wife, but as the president's mom. Truman had a really interesting, enduring philosophy of leadership. I learned, he said at one point in his memoirs, and he said this in public too, that a great leader is a man who has the ability to get other people to do what they don't want to do and like it. And so it was with Truman. The ability to persuade was almost like a hypnotic effect that he tried to have on people. And it didn't always work, but when it did, it was quite impressive. Truman was also, ever since his youth, a voracious reader. Not all readers are leaders, he said, also in his memoirs, but all leaders are readers. How true that was. The time to the willingness to take time to study, to sit down with a book and soak it up and let the wisdom of the past guide you. And above all, history. My debt to history, he said, is one which cannot be calculated. I know of no other motivation which so accounts for my awakening interest as a young lad in the principles of leadership and government. And what did he read most of all? The Lives of Famous Greeks and Romans by Plutarch. Wonderful collection of ancient texts. Yep, it was the same with those old birds in Greece and Rome as it is now. History goes in cycles. He has a very Greek outlook on things. The only thing new in the world is the history that you don't know. What a fantastic quote. Interesting coming from Truman, who never went to college. He completed high school, and that was about it. He might have gone, except his family fell on economic hard times, but his reading habits always stayed with him, even in the White House. At the most pressing decision moments, most stressful days, he would take time to go sit by himself, sometimes out on the balcony, and read some Plutarch to get reacquainted with Greek wisdom. Early on, it did not seem that Truman would really rise to anything more than a local politician in Missouri. But Tom Pendergast, the Democratic political boss in Kansas City, approached Truman and recruited him for a Senate seat. Truman was way down on Pendergast's list. He asked actually several other people to take this position as a U.S. senator. But for one reason or another, they couldn't, and so finally he settled on Harry Truman. The Pendergast machine, though, was a shady operation. It made huge amounts of money from gambling, from bootlegging in the 1920s, and indeed, it was rumored that Tom Pendergast had mafia connections, that he himself was actually in the mafia in Kansas City at the time. Did Harry Truman know this? Or if he knew, did he care? It's a bit of a mystery, but this was a connection that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He always defended Tom Pendergast. All he said was, hey, he's a political boss like any other political boss. He helps guys get elected, that's it. But still, this was a major problem for Truman's reputation early in his career, and indeed throughout his presidency. What is your connection with Tom Pendergast? He would often be asked by reporters, and he would just dodge the question. But with the help of Pendergast and the Pendergast machine, he submitted his candidacy to be a U.S. Senator, having only been a local politician in city councils and things like that. He ran, though, on the promise of supporting the New Deal in 1934, and that got him a lot of support, and off he went to the U.S. Senate. He was highly supportive of the Social Security Act, of the National Labor Relations Act, just about everything that FDR expected from Congress. Harry Truman was there to give his support to. The Democratic Party was at that time dominated by New Dealers, and Truman was definitely one of them. His major claim to fame, though, came as he headed up the Truman Committee in the U.S. Senate, a committee entrusted with reviewing all of the expenditures on defense contracts for the federal government. Where was the money going? How were the defense industries spending it? Was it possible that they were embezzling funds? The only way to find out was not so much to subpoena people and ask them questions. No, forget that, said Harry Truman. He got in his car and hit the road and drove something like 5,000 miles in a huge loop around the southern part of the country and then up into Detroit. And he would just show up at the gates of major defense plants with big government contracts and chit chat with the guard for a little while and kind of talk his way in. And finally, whoever was in charge would give him a tour of the plant. And no one ever thought to ask who this guy was. Remember, there had been Nazi saboteurs. There was espionage in the United States in World War II. But somehow Harry Truman was just such a sweet talker that no one really suspected him. And by the time he was done, the people in charge had laid out all the books and given him all the information, and he just seemed like a local guy who was interested and patriotic. Little did they know, he took very careful notes of all this, brought it all back to Washington, and had a huge expose, the Truman Committee did, on all the expenditures going into the defense contracts. And real questions came up about where this money was going and if it was being spent well. And Congress finally tightened up the appropriations given to defense Not that it was meant to undermine the war, of course, but to make sure that we were just responsible with taxpayer dollars. This got Harry Truman a lot of positive attention, especially from Franklin Roosevelt. You'll recall Roosevelt in his third term had Henry Wallace as vice president. And as he approached his fourth term, or the run for president the fourth time, he really had to think hard about who would be his vice president because he knew that he was in very ill health. He tried to hide it from most people, but Roosevelt definitely knew. And so he chose the feisty senator from Missouri. At this point, Harry Truman was 50 years old. I mean, he was quite up in age, but he was very high energy. He really proved his ability in the U.S. Senate, and so Roosevelt asked him to be vice president. Truman was quite reluctant. He enjoyed the legislative process. He loved being in the Senate. He loved representing the state of Missouri. But the president asked, and so he consented. His major question, of course, was, how is the president's health really? He asked, and everyone reassured him, oh, Roosevelt is fine. Don't worry about it. He'll just be his vice president for one term, and then he'll probably step down. His time as vice president was filled with a lot of boredom, a lot of goofing off, a lot of drinking his favorite drink, bourbon. The only major media attention he got was a piano performance with Lauren Bacall, the actress who was pretty well known for stealing the husbands of other actresses in Hollywood. And so here she was with Harry Truman on top of the piano singing along with some popular tune. Bess was furious. How dare you let this happen, Harry? He apologized profusely, said it would never happen again. That was his closest brush with marital infidelity. He just wasn't the type of guy, though, for that. And sure enough, just a couple of months into Roosevelt's presidency, following the last meeting with the Allies to divide up Europe following World War II, Franklin Roosevelt passed away. Truman was summoned to the White House, and Eleanor Roosevelt famously put her arm around Harry's shoulder and said, "The president is dead, Harry." "What do you say?" Harry responded, I'm so sorry. If there's anything I can do for you, please let me know." To which she responded, No. If there's anything we can do for you, you are the one in trouble now." Ominous words coming from the First Lady. In a way, though, she wasn't just speaking to Harry Truman. She was speaking to all subsequent presidents. Who could be Roosevelt again, now that Roosevelt had set the tone for what the president was supposed to be? And so he joined the long line of vice presidents who had become president. The difference, of course, being that Roosevelt knew he was going to die in office. Abraham Lincoln hadn't. William Henry Harrison hadn't. But Roosevelt did. Truman had been chosen. And so he immediately took his oath of office in a very awkward ceremony when he accidentally held the Bible when First Lady Bess was supposed to hold it. He was halfway through his oath before someone said, "Oh, wait, she's supposed to hold the Bible." "Oh, well, whatever." And he finished up his oath of office and went about his business. What kind of president was Truman going to be? Was he just going to be a guy who administered the rest of Franklin Roosevelt's term of office and then step down? Could he live up to the expectations of Roosevelt? Well, he met those questions head on. He knew the responsibility, though, was quite daunting. He said in a press conference, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know whether you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when you told me yesterday what had happened, the president had died, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. I've got the most terribly responsible job a man ever had." Finally, it happened. Victory in Europe Day. The Allies met in Berlin. American GIs coming from the west, Russians coming from the east, the friendly handshakes, comrades in war to bring down Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler committed suicide. His high command went into hiding, and the Nazi regime finally broke. Victory in Europe Day. It's all over. What to do now, though? We'd seen the first two conferences with the Allies. Of course, the one in Yalta, Franklin Roosevelt showed up very sick, quite out of it, only able to put his faith in the United Nations in hopes that the Security Council would moderate Russian ambitions. Joseph Stalin, though, was surprised to meet a whole different United States president. when they met in Potsdam in West Germany. This wasn't the frail, decrepit Franklin Roosevelt that he was used to. It was a sprite, sharp Harry Truman. And unlike Roosevelt, Truman did not trust Stalin, and he was not about to give Stalin everything he wanted. But the possibility of conflict with the Soviets, after we had just won this war with Nazi Germany, was a tremendous risk. Winston Churchill had advised that we continue west, that the Allies keep going, or continue east, sorry, that the Allies keep going east and try to take East Germany and the eastern part of Europe back from the Russians and ensure that they would have free and democratic governments. But indeed, the Russian presence was so great, and Russians were so prepared to keep fighting, even if it was with former allies, Truman finally backed down. And the agreement was that Europe would be divided. The Soviets would be allowed to extend their sphere of influence into Eastern Europe. And immediately they started setting up a variety of puppet states, of governments faithful to communism, to Soviet control: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. And of course, Germany would be divided. The Allies would occupy West Germany, and the Soviets would occupy East Germany, setting up a Soviet-style government there. The city of Berlin, the capital, was within East Germany. Berlin, too, though, was divided between the Allies on one side, the French, the British, and the Americans, and the Soviets on the other. And so began the first steps toward the Cold War. That constant anticipation of what the Russians would do, the attempt to try to foresee what their designs actually were, to try to treat Stalin like a friend even though he was quite untrustworthy. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the war with Japan continued. But in August 6th of 1945, out in the desert of New Mexico, a highly classified project had been underway for months. The top physicists working together, trying to figure out a way to split the atom and unleash the energy that held that basic building block of reality together. It had been proposed originally that it could be unleashed to produce energy, and of course it does in the form of nuclear power plants. But it was also possible that that energy could be unleashed to cause a massive chain reaction and produce an atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project was very top secret. Everyone working on it, most of the people working on it, didn't even know what the master plan was. But finally, in August 6th, Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant German physicist who put his mind to work for the United States war effort, planned and detonated the first atomic bomb. First, that sheer of white light, bright as sunlight, blinding, and then the blast that spreads outward in a concentric circle that could just knock out a major city, knock down buildings, and cause complete destruction. The flash itself would cause terrible burns to anyone directly exposed to it. And then the characteristic bomb that produced the mushroom cloud. How would it be delivered, Harry Truman said as soon as he was briefed on this project and told that it was a success. A B-52 bomber could fly at high altitude over a target and drop a bomb on a major city that would detonate several yards above the ground and produce a blast that would wipe out millions of people in a single flash. Truman famously said, "Use it." He did not even hesitate. He wrote in his memoirs later, "I would have done it all again. If it meant bringing those boys home from the war, if it meant ending this terrible conflict in the Pacific that had dragged on, especially as it looked like the United States was going to have to invade mainland Japan. Then what? Casualties on both sides would be much, much worse than the use of this bomb would." Some advisors said, "Why don't we detonate it out in the ocean in view of the Japanese Navy? Just show them that we have it and show the destructive power of this bomb." He didn't think it would work. He thought it was highly necessary to just use it on Japanese cities. And so it was used. Hiroshima, bombed in August of 1945, and just a few days later, the city of Nagasaki. And the bomber caught the image of that mushroom cloud rising up into the air. And then came later the reports, the photos of the destruction in the cities. A single bomb had done this. All the air raids on Tokyo and the carpet bombing, this was just one detonation, and that was all it took. And so we enter the nuclear age. Presidents, as commander-in-chief, are given the ultimate responsibility to use nuclear weapons. Without a declaration of war, an immediate response to a nuclear attack from a foreign country, the President of the United States is entrusted with this duty. We'll talk about the President's nuclear responsibilities as they advance and as they become more complex, especially by the 1960s, and then finally the end of the Cold War. But this is where it started. Harry Truman's unthinking use of the nuclear bomb. Just a few days later, August 15th, the Japanese High Command agreed to meet and give total and unconditional surrender to the United States. And the US invaded the Japanese mainland and started to rebuild and redesign the government. It was General Douglas MacArthur who was responsible for designing the new Japanese government. It would be a democratic system under a constitution, it would have a parliament, it would have a prime minister. All of that was given directly to the Japanese people by the United States. So, victory in Japan, August 15th, 1945. As the rest of the world was in rubble and the destruction of the Second World War, the United States remained largely untouched by these troubles. And so, as the troops came home, the possibility of a quiet life of peace and prosperity was there, and Americans ascended to a height of prosperity and wealth unseen in all of world history. The ads from this era say it all. Everything from chocolates to, I guess it was chocolates, everything else. It was a time for peace and building your home, and of course, having lots and lots of babies. The ads really touched on kind of the emotional dynamic of the era. The soldiers coming home, the significance of that. Never, never again will I go sailing, said the song at the beginning. The silverware, I guess, is what caused, as we know, the massive explosion of the population of the United States. The baby boomers, here they come. My parents are in there somewhere. Yeah, you see the population shift in this dramatic way because of the post-war America. Guys who'd been shot at, coming home to their fiancés, and a whole bunch of people having lots and lots of kids. What does this do, though, to the demographics of the United States? Ever since the baby boomers after World War II, we've been able to mark distinct generations. The baby boomers have Generation X, that's me, and then Generation Y, and the millennials. They are the first wave, or the first drop in the pond, you might say, that caused these predictable ripples that continue. So it is with major wartime baby booms. So it was with the United States. Interesting to think, too, 3 presidents were all born the same year, post-war year of 1946. Donald Trump, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. Joe Biden, I believe, was born in 1942. But yeah, that whole generation is kind of reaching their, you might say, their climactic end right now. Most of them are retiring. Most of them are cashing out on Social Security. Of course, millennials are wondering, where's our Social Security going to be? Yeah, the baby boomers will come to be the defining force of American demographics for years to come. Domestic policy, Harry Truman didn't just lay low and administer the New Deal. No, he took the initiative and insisted that he was going to maintain and advance the New Deal legacy with what he called the Fair Deal. It would go a step beyond the New Deal. The New Deal alone was not sufficient. There had to be more. There was more of a government role to be had here. The legislative program, he said, the Fair Deal, was to be a reminder to the Democratic Party, to the country, and to Congress that progress in government lies along the road to sound reform in our private enterprise system, and that progressive democracy has to continue to keep pace with changing conditions. We must march along with history, he said. And so his attempt to codify Roosevelt's vision and make it an official and enduring thing in American politics called for what he called a Second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis for security and prosperity could be established for all, regardless of station, race, or creed. And indeed, he will be the first major civil rights president, as we'll see. But what did this mean? Everyone was entitled in this new Bill of Rights to a useful and remunerative job, adequate medical care, a decent home, and a good education. It was meant to expand. the New Deal was, and so Harry Truman would ensure that it would. He called for an extension of Social Security to more workers, a higher national minimum wage, national health insurance, urban development, and full employment. A grand scheme, but it was doomed. The Republican Party made its comeback in 1946, led by Robert Taft, who was indeed the son of William Howard Taft, and he was a principled and conservative Republican. And his conservatism was all about sort of a fiscal downsizing of government, getting government out of the economy, allowing the economy to go the way that it was supposed to, really a return to his father's ideals and the ideals of the 1920s. And so Robert Taft led the Republicans to victory in 1946 and really let Harry Truman know that there's a new party in Congress and they were not going to go along with this broad expansion of the federal government in American lives. Even though it intended to do good, it simply had no place there. Self-reliance was the rule, minimal government that allowed for prosperity in society, as his father had taught. The first major blow to the New Deal legacy came from the Taft-Hartley Bill, or also called the Hartley-Taft Bill, which Taft himself was a signatory to. A bill that was designed to put very stringent regulations on labor unions and also protect people who didn't want to join labor unions, protect them from paying dues, protect them from ostracism in the workplace. Well, a lot of unions view this as a great deal of hostility coming from congressional Republicans against them. And so the push against the Taft-Hartley bill was everywhere. It was frequently called the slave labor law. It had to end. And so, given the pressure from labor unions and all the opponents of the bill, when it arrived on Harry Truman's desk, he vetoed it. He went on the radio, as FDR had often done, and said, we do not want legislation which will take fundamental rights away from working people. And so his veto was signed. But Congress at this point had such a strong Republican presence, as well as many conservative Democrats turning against the New Deal vision, that they were able to override Truman's veto, and he was forced to enforce a law that he fundamentally disagreed with. Among Truman's goals, though, when it came to extending and broadening the New Deal with the Fair Deal, there was, of course, civil rights. You remember other presidents had kind of talked about civil rights. Theodore Roosevelt had invited Booker Washington to the White House. Even Warren Harding, you might recall, had said that he was ready to consider some kind of civil rights proposal. He died of a heart attack before he had a chance. Franklin Roosevelt had taken action on civil rights when it came to defense contracts, but only because of the first March on Washington. But finally, Harry Truman says that he was ready to take a much more active role in civil rights. He viewed the role of the president as a neutral figure in this advocacy for Black Americans. And he also thought that it was indeed the purpose of government. If we're going to extend rights to all Americans, that means all Americans. It's my deep conviction that we have reached a turning point in our country's efforts to guarantee freedom and equality for everybody since the New Deal. Recent events in the United States and abroad, even overseas, realize the spreading of human rights everywhere. Have made us realize that it is more important today than ever before to ensure that all Americans enjoy these rights. And when I say all Americans, I mean all Americans, he said to his speech to the NAACP. He gave the speech on the steps of the Lincoln Monument, the very same place where we would later see Martin Luther King in the March on Washington speech. This was indeed the promise of American life, and Truman was ready to fulfill it any way he could. Truman's Attorney General pointed out something very important in his testimony before Congress. James McGranary said that there was a foreign policy interest in civil rights as well. The existence of discrimination against minority groups in the United States has an adverse effect on our relations with other countries. Here we are, the advocates of freedom, and yet we deny freedom to our own citizens? The United States is under constant attack in the foreign press, over the foreign radio, and in such international bodies as the United Nations, because of various practices of discrimination in this country. Indeed, the Soviets found out about lynchings and all of the crimes against African Americans committed in the United States, and they knew how to capitalize on it. there's Lady Liberty observing a lynching. Something had to be done. Well, Truman proposed his plans to Congress, and they went absolutely nowhere. The Southern delegation at this time and on through the 1960s chaired all the major committees that would even consider any kind of civil rights legislation, and they made sure that no such legislation would get through. So, true to his style, Harry Truman took action himself. Not in society, he couldn't quite address Jim Crow laws and that kind of thing, but he could, as commander in chief, desegregate the military. And so he did by executive order. Many black troops had served in black regiments valiantly in World War II, and Truman was going to make sure that they would not be treated this way anymore. What effect did this have on the military? There was some hubbub, but ultimately it made a peaceful transition into integrated units and seemed quite prepared for desegregation. And so those segregated units that had been around since the Civil War no longer existed. Roosevelt had been very careful with the Democratic coalition, making sure he did everything he could to hold the South, the Solid South as they were called, within the Democratic base. But Truman didn't care. He loved the Democratic Party, he was faithful to the New Deal vision, but the New Deal was much more important to him than the Democrats themselves were. In response to all of his civil rights proposals, you saw the rise of the Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond, senator from the South, and they broke away from the Democratic Party, arguing not so much for race, though everyone knew that's what was really going on, but more states' rights, the right of states to have their sovereignty respected against federal control. So Strom Thurmond rallied together a huge chunk of the Southern Democrats and led them in the segregation party, states' rights party at the time, as the election of 1948 approached. So Strom Thurmond from the left or from the right? From the left, though, Henry Wallace, who you recall had been Franklin Roosevelt's vice president, made his big comeback and announced his candidacy for the Progressive Party, who threatened to steal many progressive Democrats away from the mainstream Democratic Party. He campaigned all over the country. He held up his famous squash that said Wallace for president somewhere in California. And he hung out with all kinds of political radicals of the time, especially Pete Seeger, the folk singer. And so Henry Wallace embodied the more leftist position that Huey Long had argued for, that Eugene Debs to some extent had argued for. The government existed to ensure fairness through active measures and all kinds of things that would bring about greater social equality. Not exactly a socialist, but much more to the left than the mainstream Democrats were. Conservatives within the Republican Party, though, always had a hard time finding a strong candidate. They ended up with, from New York, a trial attorney who had recently gotten involved in Republican Party politics, Thomas Dewey. Dewey was an odd character. You recall he ran against Roosevelt back in the day and didn't have a chance. Well, here's his comeback again, running against Harry Truman. All he could really say was that Americans are tired of the New Deal. We don't really want these proposals anymore. And yet he didn't really have a principled conservatism to it all, the way that Taft and many of other Republicans did. And he was a very odd candidate. He was fond of strange slogans, keep the ass off the White House grass, and he was a very awkward campaigner. One incident, he was giving a speech on the back of a train at a whistle stop, and the conductor accidentally jammed the train into gear in the middle of his speech, and Dewey went tumbling off the back, climbed back up the ladder, cursing and swearing in front of his audience. Just not a very good showing for Dewey. But Dewey did seem to have quite a following, not among his supporters, but those who really were tired of the New Deal legacy, who really did buy into the conservatism of Robert Taft. And as the polls started counting public opinion, it really looked like Dewey might have a significant edge over Truman. And so the cartoon says, "What's the point of even going through with this? It seems like I'm going to win," says Dewey. And so here's Truman, Dewey from the Republican Party, within the Democrats, Henry Wallace to the left, Strom Thurmond to the right, and the president trying to steer the Democratic donkey straight, even though they're calling to the donkey on either side. Of course, haw and G means when you're plowing in a field, that's the donkey is trained, or the mule is trained to hear those phrases and to turn left or right. And the donkey itself looks quite confused. It really looks like Truman's days are numbered, that he is not going to win the election of 1948. The polls are against him. The dissent within the Democratic Party is against him, and it looks like it's over. But Truman, true to his style, full of sass, campaigned vigorously, whistle stops all over the country, speeches and speeches, and went out of his way to try to garner as much support as he could, despite all the odds. It was a miraculous election. And of course, despite the pollsters, Truman won. On the eve of Election Day, it had actually been predicted by all the pollsters that Dewey won. And the Chicago Daily Tribune and several newspapers ran the story. Dewey defeats Truman. It's over. And then the votes were counted. And then the Electoral College added up. And it was quite clear, no, it was quite wrong. Truman defeats Dewey. It really showed, though, Truman's grit, his willingness to rise above all obstacles and overcome and overcome and overcome just by his sheer and impressive force of will. Cartoon says it all. Anybody but Truman, they all say. But as soon as Election Day comes, somehow Democrats just can't bring themselves to go along with anyone else. The Southern victory, though, was quite significant. The Dixiecrats took South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and one of Tennessee's electoral votes. A huge exodus out of the Democratic Party. They would later fold back in, but still, it showed what a loose coalition the Democrats were. Let's turn then to Truman's foreign policy, dealing with the post-war world and the rise of the Cold War. George Kennan, diplomat to the Soviet Union over in Moscow, spent some time there trying to solidify good relations with the Russians and make sure that we were all on the same page in the post-Cold War world. And yet he realized right away that the Russians were quite untrustworthy, that Stalin was really paranoid, that the Soviets did not trust the United States. Everywhere he went in Moscow, people were following him, taking pictures of him from far away. He was sure his telephone was bugged, and he had to get message back to the United States that the Russians were not our friends anymore. And so he sent the famous long telegram explaining the sources of Soviet conduct, explaining the situation in the Cold War, that all of the good feelings we had with the Soviets in World War II are now gone. What does the future hold for our relations with this country? Kennan's major suggestion to Truman, which Truman took very seriously, was the need to contain communism. We could not engage in a direct conflict. It would escalate too fast and be much too deadly. Remember, this is even before the Soviets had developed nuclear weapons. Even then, Kennan could see that. And Truman agreed. And so Truman announced to the nation a new plan in dealing with Soviet communism. It came in response to another speech, a very important speech given by Prime Minister Winston Churchill at the University of Missouri as he took a visit to Truman's home state. And he announced that as you look at the situation with the Soviets in Eastern Europe, as he put it, an iron curtain was descending across Europe. And the other side of that iron curtain is Soviet puppet states. We must prevent the Iron Curtain from spreading any further west into war-torn Western European countries. What if France fell to Soviet influence? Or Italy, or Spain? The major concern quickly became Greece and Turkey. There's Churchill looking under the Iron Curtain, which most people thought was sort of a ridiculous image at the time, but it became quite apparent that the Soviets really were out for expanding their influence further and further west. Indeed, Marxist doctrine taught that communism was meant to spread. It had to be stopped. And so, following the advice of George Kennan and Winston Churchill, Truman gave his major address to Congress in March of 1947. He announced the Truman Doctrine. What was the Truman Doctrine? We couldn't risk a direct confrontation with the Soviets. So what do? We try to contain Soviet communism and its spread. He said to Congress, I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid, which is essential to economic stability and an orderly political process. How will we contain Soviet communism? We will try to appeal to countries that are teetering on the edge with financial assistance. We will outspend the Soviets. And that becomes the major Cold War strategy for years to come, all the way up to the Reagan administration. At the urging of Winston Churchill, the United States gave $400 million of aid to Greece and Turkey, two war-torn countries, which themselves had big communist factions within their governments that were ready to hand over their country to the Soviets. So the US proved its ability to outspend with foreign aid the Soviets. There's Uncle Sam with his dollar bill Tommy gun. It will indeed be the US dollar that patrols the Mediterranean, the cartoons say. We will outspend and outspend and outspend. After the emergency measures, though, came a much grander plan where Congress appropriated $12 billion to rebuild Europe, especially Western Europe. So that's West Germany, that's Britain, that's France, that's Spain. Certain countries got more than others, but all of this spending was essential, rebuilding infrastructure, ensuring prosperity in those countries, because the Soviets were ready to give their aid as well, on condition that those countries give themselves over to communism, to communist dictators. Immediately after the election in 1948, the Soviets sealed off Berlin, including the western part of Berlin, from access to West Germany. To show his solidarity, to show that he would be able to stand up to the Soviets, Harry Truman provided the Berlin airlift, plane after plane in the US Air Force, dropping crates of food and supplies, letting the people of West Berlin know that the United States would not abandon them to Soviet aggression, and to let the Soviets know that we really were willing to apply force when necessary in response to their own actions. Truman negotiated and the US Senate ratified one of the most important Cold War treaties, still with us today, though the Cold War is long over, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, binding together Western democratic countries into a common security force that would respond to any kind of aggression, spreading communism to other places. In response, the Soviets had the Warsaw Pact, binding together Eastern European countries and a few of their allies around the world under their common agreement to resist what they perceived as American aggression. Truman's idea of containing communism had barely taken hold when China, after a long drawn-out civil war, fell to communism in 1949. Mao Zedong gave his famous speech introducing the Communist Party under the support of the Soviet Union, and China is now communist. This is an interesting transition for China, very much like Russia. Communist theory always taught that you had to go through an industrial phase before you became communist. China had not done that. China was still agrarian. Most Chinese people were still peasants, still working on farms. And so Mao, much like his Soviet counterparts, went out of their way to justify their unique style of communism, that it was true to their Chinese heritage, that it was a fulfillment of Confucian ideals. And so Mao Zedong brought about later the Cultural Revolution, this radical upheaval in Chinese life. Harry Truman took much of the blame for losing China. Why wasn't it contained there? Why couldn't we do anything? Well, China is big and complex and intimidating, as future presidents will find, even as we know today. But when a communist faction in Korea announced that it was going to seek Soviet support and try to turn Korea communist after World War II, the United States was much quicker to respond. North Korea consolidated an alliance with Joseph Stalin and tried to turn the whole country communist with the aid of the Soviets, much like China had. Kim Il-sung, as we know, the first of the dictators of North Korea, his grandson is now the dictator. The United Nations, the Security Council met to respond to North Korean aggression, and they took a vote on how The Allied countries ought to respond to this, that we would indeed use military force. Of course, what that meant at the time was that the United States would use military force. This was surprising given the procedures within the Security Council as they still exist today. The Soviets were allowed to veto this, but they took the vote in a hurry as the Soviet representative was not there. Truman presented the situation to Congress in June of 1950, arguing that the United States had a whole new responsibility in the world, and that he, as commander-in-chief, had a unique responsibility to be what he called, and what the president has come to be called, the leader of the free world. Did he ask Congress for a declaration of war, or even any kind of authorization of military force? No, he explained to Congress that he already had that authorization as commander-in-chief, and the situation and circumstances of the Cold War, it required him to respond to the United Nations and the Security Council's decision. And so he did. We see his speech to Congress on page 186 of core documents. And here he explains why he intends to take independent presidential action in response to aggression in Korea, in response to the Security Council's resolution. In this connection, he says on page 186 in the middle, I think it is important that the nature of our military action in Korea be understood. I should be made perfectly clear that the action was undertaken as a matter of basic moral principle. The United States was going to the aid of a nation established and supported by the United Nations and unjustifiably attacked by an aggressive force. In these circumstances, we must take action to ensure that the increased national defense needs will be met, and that in the process we do not bring on an inflation which is the resulting hardship for every family. He asked Congress for authorization for price controls, the same way that Franklin Roosevelt had. At the same time, we must recognize that it will be necessary for a number of years to support continued defense expenditures, including assistance to other nations at a higher level than we previously planned. We must continue with the Marshall Plan. But above all, he says, we need to recognize that in international emergencies, the president is the leader of the free world, and he does not need congressional approval for what he does. If they disapprove so much, they can cut the funding on the military, which of course he knew they would never do. He says on page 187 in the middle, the free world has made it clear through the United Nations that lawless aggression will be met with force. This is the significance of Korea. It is a significance whose importance cannot be overestimated. Skip down a few paragraphs. The Congress of the United States, by its strong bipartisan support of the steps we are taking and by repeated actions in support of international cooperation, has contributed most vitally to the cause for peace. They've done this with the Marshall Plan. They must continue to do it by simply letting the president take direct action in response to UN resolutions. Think about what's happening here. Abraham Lincoln took drastic wartime measures because he believed that it was part of his mandate to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, as outlined in his oath of office and in the Constitution. He was executing the will of the Constitution. Or take the situation with Theodore Roosevelt, the fact that he saw himself fulfilling the mandate of the people. Truman didn't make either argument. Truman saw his presidency as responding fundamentally to the United Nations, not Congress, not really even to the Constitution. That's just the situation in the Cold War, Truman said, and that's what we must accept. And so, the Korean War, the US involvement in it, really turned out to be the most extraordinary use of presidential war power we have ever seen before or since. Since Truman, presidents have gotten at least some kind of approval from Congress. Perhaps Congress was manipulated in things like Vietnam, perhaps they weren't, but still, presidents still felt the need to go to Congress. But Truman is really the only president in all of our history who didn't, and didn't even try. And so in September of 1950, the United States Army lands in Incheon under the guidance of the famous general from World War II, the guy who had won the Pacific back, the guy who had helped frame the new Japanese government. Now he was in charge of the invasion of Korea, and U.S. troops began landing in Incheon that fall under the watch of Douglas MacArthur. This was a significant conflict. 150,000 American troops deployed. By the time the war was over in about 3 years, by 1953, 33,686 casualties. The war in Korea, though, had very limited and specific objectives. It was not about bringing down the Korean regime. It was about simply applying the Truman Doctrine and containing communism. General MacArthur had other ideas, though. As the war advanced, he argued that the United States ought to push as far north as possible, and by November of 1950, they had, almost all the way up to the Yalu River. And by the time American troops were there, he was ready to turn around and tell the president, we're going to continue on into Red China and bring down that communist regime too. And of course, a lot of people thought this made sense because Truman had lost communist China. But containment meant not ending the North Korean regime. It definitely didn't mean going all the way to China. What it meant instead was simply containing communism, stopping it at the 38th parallel, which divided the Korean peninsula. And that was all. So public statements going back and forth and contradicting each other between Douglas MacArthur talking to the press and President Harry Truman. And it got so bad that Truman finally summoned MacArthur back to the United States and fired him. This was a bold move on the president's part. Normally, presidents knew how to defer to the authority of generals, but Truman was much more willing to micromanage things on the ground. And in hindsight, it did make some sense. What would have happened if we had marched all the way up to the Yalu River? What would have happened if we engaged hostilities with communist China? Things really could have spun out of control. Truman later observed in his memoirs, this conflict with General MacArthur was a most extraordinary statement for a military commander of the United Nations to issue on his own responsibility. It was an act of total disregard, totally disregarding all directives to abstain from any declarations on foreign policy. It was, in fact, open defiance of my orders as President and Commander-in-Chief. This was a challenge to the authority of the President under the Constitution. It also flouted the policy of what's more important for Truman, the United Nations. And so MacArthur was removed, even though MacArthur was probably much more popular than Truman was. Cartoonists had a lot of fun with this image. And so MacArthur was fired, and Truman's popularity rating just plummeted. But true to his style, he did not care. His grit, his drive, his desire to always do the right thing as he saw it, regardless of what anyone thought, moved Truman forward with this decision. Youngstown, Ohio. A steel plant faces one of many strikes. The strike got a little out of hand, and the protesters ended up burning much of the steel mill. What is the federal government to do? Remember, we had the National Labor Relations Board that would oversee these kinds of disputes, but Truman pointed out that we were in a different situation fighting the war in Korea. We could not stand for steel mills shutting down when wartime production was essential. Congress had passed legislation in 1950 authorizing the president to take control of wartime production when necessary, but Truman didn't really feel like he needed it. He simply used his own presidential authority to continue a war which had never been declared, which rested entirely on his own role as commander-in-chief. And so he sent in federal agents to seize the steel mills in Youngstown and make sure that production continued. This was a very, very bold move on Truman's part, bolder even than getting involved in Korea in the first place. He didn't look to any legislation that authorized him to do this. The Taft-Hartley Act actually did. So too did the Wartime Production Act of 1950. No, he simply argued for his inherent powers as President of the United States. And so Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company brought suit against the United States government in 1952. And the case was appealed quickly to the United States Supreme Court. And the court ruled the court ruled against Harry Truman and in favor of Youngstown. One of the few times the court ever ruled against a president post-FDR. What was the argument? Well, the majority opinion was written by Hugo Black. And it was very cut and dry. Black liked things very simple. If you ever read his judicial opinions, it says basically that Congress is authorized to reimburse people, for property seized under eminent domain, not the president. Therefore, this was unconstitutional. Done. And he wrote his opinion in just a couple of paragraphs. It was Robert Jackson, though, who had much bigger insights on this. Jackson is widely regarded as the most brilliant justice of the 20th century. He had a legal mind unlike anybody else, and he didn't see things so simple and cut and dry the way Black did. Jackson had foresight. He thought about future presidents and their situation, and he said that the court needs to provide some kind of guidelines for understanding what is a legal, independent presidential action and what is not. And so he pointed out, if Congress gives a declaration of war, all right, the president stands at the height of his wartime authority. His authority is at a maximum, said Jackson, for it includes all that he possesses in his own right, plus all that Congress can delegate. But things get trickier when you're talking about the president either responding to a crisis or initiating some kind of military action in the absence of either congressional grant or denial of authority. Now, of course, at the other extreme, when Congress has explicitly said no or cut the funding, all right, then the president's power is at his lowest ebb. He can't do anything. It's between a declaration of war and congressional prohibition that you have what Jackson famously called a zone of twilight. A zone of twilight when the law is silent, in which the president and Congress have what he calls concurrent authority. So, does that guide us into the future when it comes to independent presidential war power? Jackson said, when the president takes measures incompatible with the expressed or implied will of Congress, his power is at its lowest ebb, for then he can rely only upon his own constitutional powers. In the case of Lincoln, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. In other emergencies, simply the commander-in-chief clause. Jackson goes on, minus any constitutional powers of Congress in the matter. Courts can sustain exclusive presidential control in such a case only by disabling the Congress from acting upon such a subject. So, when can the president act militarily without congressional approval? Can he respond to a foreign attack? Yeah, that makes sense. Can he anticipate a foreign attack? That's when it gets trickier. By the time we get to the Bush administration in the 2000s, can he invade a foreign country? Jackson's framework is helpful, but as we'll see, the zone of twilight leaves us with a bit of confusion about presidential war power. Congress in the future will try to rein it in. We'll talk about the War Powers Act. We'll talk about interactions between presidents and Congresses over war. But in a lot of ways, the question has never entirely been settled. As a show of goodwill with Harry Truman, Chief Justice Fred Vinson had all 9 justices of the Supreme Court, as well as President Truman and his staff, over for drinks. Truman surprised everyone when he showed up in a Hawaiian shirt, dressed very casually, having been slapped down by the U.S. Supreme Court. His famous words were, everyone said, sorry we had to do this to you, Mr. President. We feel bad. And he says, I don't care much for your law, court, but golly, this bourbon is good. And everyone laughed. So here we see a president submitting to a ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court when he very easily could have ignored it, citing his war powers. He could have done like Andrew Jackson and Cherokee removal and just ignored the court's ruling. He could have justified his action the way Abraham Lincoln had, but no, Truman submitted. So here we have the most powerful wartime president in all of American history, taking his cue from the United Nations, initiating a full-scale war in a foreign country, all on his own initiative, and yet submitting to the U.S. Supreme Court when it came to steel production. We saw the executive office of the president under Franklin Roosevelt's leadership. Well, Truman extended the executive office with a bunch of advisory boards, one of them being the Council of Economic Advisors. Truman famously said, give me a one-handed economist. A one-handed economist? Why? Well, because all economists do is sit around and say, well, on one hand, well, on the other hand, no, just give me ones that give me sound advice about what legislation I ought to support, about what I ought to veto, that kind of thing. And so the Council of Economic Advisors was established to advise the president on all economic matters. And several other councils came along later. Probably one of the most important ones, still with us today, the National Security Council, consisting of several members of his cabinet dealing with foreign affairs, advising the president on all questions of national security, which became the all-important thing through the course of the Cold War, later transitions to terrorism after the Cold War. The Department of Navy, Department of the Army used to be separate cabinet positions with their own secretaries. But under Truman's guidance, there was created the Department of Defense, which would unify all the branches of the military under a single secretary, the Secretary of Defense, who would address the president directly as a cabinet level position. The DoD still with us today. Along with the Department of Defense came the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The chair of each branch of the military would work directly with the president, dealing with peacetime as well as wartime military affairs. His role as commander-in-chief required him to be in close contact with each branch of the military and understanding its needs and understanding his role as commander-in-chief. Each branch of the military had traditionally had their own intelligence division, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. It was time, Truman argued, and Congress agreed, for central intelligence. And so the Central Intelligence Agency was created under Truman's watch. And this body becomes immensely important through the course of the Cold War, not only for gathering intelligence and anticipation of what the Soviet Union was doing, but also, as we'll see, for taking direct action of all kinds, military coups in foreign countries, and not a few assassinations in the coming years. Following Franklin Roosevelt's stunning 4 terms as president, Congress started to consider the possibility that the precedent left behind by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson down through the years needed to be formalized in the Constitution. And so an amendment was proposed, the 22nd Amendment, that would limit presidential terms to 2. No president could serve more than 2 terms, or 8 years. Truman, of course, being the first one. Was this a problem for executive energy? Remember, Alexander Hamilton argued in Federalist 72 that the president ought to be reelected again and again and again. If we got a good president who was energetic and wanted to deserve another term, the people ought to be able to give it to him. But no, something had changed in the modern presidency. 2 terms seemed sufficient. Wendell Willkie, remember, had argued this as he ran against Roosevelt in 1940. So the amendment was passed and ratified by the states, and it's now a formal part of the U.S. Constitution. No president will serve for more than 2 terms. And so Truman stepped down as Dwight Eisenhower won the presidency and took the oath of office in 1953, but he stuck around. Truman offered all kinds of guidance and advice to future presidents of both parties. There he is with Eisenhower, there he is with Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon. He was a very trusted advisor to all kinds of presidents. He really understood the ins and outs of the difficulties of being a modern president. He had set the tone for what it meant to be a modern president. Truman left office with abysmal approval ratings. It was, again, a miracle that he won the presidency in 1948. It was a miracle he was able to pull off all the things that he did. But it all came down to just his own grit and personal drive. His famous words, "The buck stops here." The perfect description for what it means to be president. What did he have to say about his own legacy? He said in some remarks in 1958, long after he was out of office, I'm proud that I'm a politician. A politician is a man who understands government, and it takes a politician to run a government. A statesman, honorable statesman, a Washington, a Lincoln, a Roosevelt. A statesman is a politician who's been dead 10 or 15 years. Who will be the best judge of my presidency, and really all presidencies? History. And indeed, history has judged quite favorably for Harry Truman. He could have been a dud. He could have been just the guy who finished out Franklin Roosevelt's term and then disappeared. But no, he took control of the presidency. He seized the moment, and indeed proved to have a great deal of his own greatness. What does this mean, though, for subsequent presidents? It's a hard question to say who can be the next Franklin Roosevelt. It's also hard to say who can live up to Harry Truman's style. What does this say for more gentlemanly presidents? Let's consider that next time as we turn to his successor, Dwight Eisenhower. See you then.